I would like to thank Aria and Paula, the research cluster, for inviting me to speak with you. It really is an honor to be with you and to see such a growing interest in LSP, and members of the research group are certainly going to be the pioneers in that area. Today I'll be presenting some practical tips, first of all, laying the groundwork for the reason we need more connections, collaboration, and communication among LSP and SSP scholars around the world. And then I'll give you some practical tips as to how we can get there quicker than we might. So what I'd like to do, I will get here. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Let's see, hold on. Okay, is that working now?
Yes.
All righty. Okay, as you can see, the title is what I was just talking about, moving the field forward through communication, connections, and collaboration. And I am going to focus on Spanish because that's what I'm most familiar with, but so many of these strategies can work for any language group for specific purposes. Okay. There we go. Okay, today I'm going to be talking about first the state of the field in a global context, challenges for SSP research in the United States, sort of a summary of the factors leading to those challenges for the lack of, I'm going to call them the 3 C's, communication, connection, and collaboration, SSP research priorities in the US, and the benefits of those 3 C's to help meet those priorities and specific strategies to establish stronger connections and collaboration. The first thing I'm going to do is talk just very briefly about Europe and Latin America, and then I'm going to go to the United States. I'm going to talk about first the theoretical frameworks and the organizations, et cetera, in each region of those regions. So in Europe and Latin America, they're grounded, the LSP studies and SSP studies are grounded in genre, discourse, and corpus analysis. Of course, works by Bhatia, Highland, Halliday, Swales, et cetera. And most of what they're doing around the world, as you can imagine, is English for specific purposes and English for academic purposes based on those theoretical frameworks. The themes that they're looking at, again, using corpus analysis to look at genre and discourse, lexicology, the specialized lexicons, genre and corpus-based pedagogy also. And then the domains in Europe and Latin America are fairly varied, go from business, journalism, tourism, science, medical, et cetera. But in the US, as you'll see, we're a little more focused on 2 in particular. The organizations for LSP, SSP in Europe, it's interesting because there's a general LSP, it used to be for Spanish, but now it's for Europe, in Spain. And a lot of the talks focus on English, but not all of them. There's Spanish for specific purposes, French, German, et cetera. And then SSP, there's a group in France and a group in the Netherlands that are focused on Spanish for specific purposes. And they have wonderful websites and resources. So the conference presentations often in Europe and Latin America, they can be in more general language conferences such as ACELE, and you have the full title here. Also in Latin America, but that tends to be more national or regional in nature, not, pan-continental. So also the conferences in Europe, the actual conferences are sponsored often by those organizations. In Latin America, there's no real organization at that level, but there is a new thing called the Encuentro Latinoamericano, LOF LATAM, which has only had 2 meetings, but they're both been virtual. And this is what Paula and Adia were talking about, that the silver lining of the pandemic is that we are now able to talk to people in our field all over the world. The majority of people in Europe and Latin America who do LSP at the university are professors. They're tenure track professors, and they're more respected. The field is more respected. Many of them do translation interpretation, and I know there are people here from the ATA. I'm not going to focus on that today. because it really is a field in and of itself, but very related to LSP and SSP. The journals, here's some general journals that those publications occur in. There are specific LSP journals in Europe. Iberica is one of them that's from IFA in Spain. There's one in Romania. There's a lot of them in Eastern Europe, and in Islas Canarias, they also have one. In Europe, there are also proceedings of those conferences. There are edited volumes. I've just given you two possible ones here. And there are also monographs that focus more on tourism or business or a specific domain. Also in Latin America, there are more general journals in which LSP and SSP specifically are published. There's an edited volume coming out next year, which will be the first one on SSP in Latin America. And the two editors are Carmen King Ramirez and her colleague, Sonia Toledo Azocar from Chile. And then monographs, Giovanni Parodi, que en paz descanse, was an absolute brilliant luminaria in this particular field. He's published on corpus linguistics and empirical data-driven studies in Spanish for years. In the United States, however, there is some genre and discourse analysis, but most of it is focused on the English for academic purposes or English for specific purposes, the same as in Europe. However, non-English LSP has a more pedagogical focus. You can see this in several of the articles at the conferences, et cetera. So they have theoretical bases, frameworks such as communicative competence, task-based for evaluation using ACTFL, world readiness standards, experiential learning and community service learning internships. That was one of the most incredible things after business language, but there was been more of a focus on CSL. And so recently there are other themes I'll talk about. And Spanish for academic purposes does exist, but with very, very few studies to date. The research themes as a result of those theoretical frameworks tend to be pedagogy, curricular development, as almost every proceeding of the ISLSP has been. Again, internships and social justice themes, conversational and oral analysis, discourse analysis. There's one major study by Hardin 2020, it's a handbook on pragmatics and medical discourse, a total volume. And the domains have tended first to be on business, and then now it's more on medical. And Glenn Martinez has a wonderful new volume just come out. So in the United States, the organizations, the only real organizations, is we now have those SIGs, but the organization in the United States of SSP is the National Association of Medical Spanish. Medical Spanish is far more advanced than today than many of the other domains. And I'm speaking at another plenary this Saturday, and Glenn Martinez is another one of the plenaristas at the Hispanic Linguistics Symposium. So they will have 2 plenaries out of 4 on Spanish for specific purposes there. So as we say, there's an AATSP SIG. ACTFL also has a social justice SIG, which might be, good to connect with. And of course, our first one here that Nadia and Paula talked about will be at ACTFL this November. The conferences, sessions and general language conferences, and then a little history here that Eastern Michigan had LSP conferences in the 80s and the 90s, and then the Cybers started to do their business language conference, and then they let other domains in as well. Finally, in 2012, thanks to the work of many people, but Lourdes Sanchez Lopez and Sherry Spain Long at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, started what has turned out to be a biannual conference. The majority of the presenters come from the same region of the conference, the same thing in Europe. There's not a lot of cross-continental attendance and are often non-tenure track professionals. The NAMS Medical Spanish Summit is also something that is attended very well. Okay, journals. Here we have SSP or LSP articles in general journals. JOLIB, which was language of business language, is now defunct, but global business language was resuscitated just recently. There are selected proceedings of those conferences and then several monographs, which I have here. So due to these regional differences and the lack of, connections, communication, and collaboration, it's difficult for SSP experts to get to know each other and to actually do collaborative projects between regions. They don't attend the same conference. They don't share the same theoretical frameworks. They don't use similar types of data or analytical approaches. The research themes and domains are often not the same. Titles and ranks of the people that are involved in it are not necessarily the same, and with different research expectations. As you know, tenure track people have many more. And similar department valuation in the US, the field does not quite have the respect that it should yet. So there, we've talked about the need to establish those connections and to get a broader and more solid theoretical, data-driven, empirical and pedagogical base, and for research and the curricular design and teaching of SSP. So here's the circle that has to happen. Okay, so what advantage is it for US LSP people, researchers or practitioners, to really care or get to know or read works from other regions? And it's exactly because the research being done, the genre-based, the discourse-based analysis, et cetera, with corpus linguistics, can help researchers answer the call to investigate the most pressing research priorities that were identified in a study that I did with Lourdes in 2017. And Mary Long was obviously part of that as well. And that was published in the particular volume that she edited. So this survey said that the top research priorities that would most benefit the students, which is what I care about, would be to understand the characteristics of native speakers' communication in oral and written modes. So you analyze, you transcribe, you analyze oral communication between doctors and patients, if you can get past the HIPAA issues. And then written professional documents, you have websites and portals, medical power of attorneys, living will, et cetera. So there are all kinds of different genres within that. There's a need to use corpus linguistics to do this, and also a need for a top-down approach. So in many of the classes, perhaps here and perhaps also in Europe for years, it was a lot of vocabulary focus on, like Spanish for business, here's a list of vocabulary, or Spanish for something else, here's a list of vocabulary. The people at the cutting edge of the LSP in the United States obviously didn't do that. They came like Steve Sacco, all these other people came up with more interesting ways. But the top-down approach they take in Europe, I think, would help here. So you analyze first the genre, the rhetorical situation, the pragmatics happening, look at the actual discourse, and then get down to the word level. And that will give a context for what's happening. Need for more research in the community with community service learning and internships. You need also critical reflection in those internships and in that to get the most out of the experience, to develop critical cultural awareness. And I think we know what that is, the definition of here, and critical language awareness. So knowledge of linguistic practices, but a critical awareness of how these practices are shaped by the social relationships of power in the community. And so putting translanguaging as part of the training for LSP teachers is good, because if they're going to interact in more than one language in the field, they need to practice that in the LSP classroom. So the researchers in the US can benefit from the European type of research that's going on with the data-driven corpus analyses, and to discover best practices for working with immigrants and people in the community. So the strategies, first one is this handbook, which I will not go into in great detail for obvious reasons. We don't have a lot of time, but this should be coming out within the next year and a half. We've had some delays. I'm the lead editor on it, and Rutledge is putting it out, and we have 31 chapters and 50-something authors. And the objective is to collaborate, because Rutledge told us you have to have authors getting together from different continents. And I said, really? So some were more receptive than others. It was easier for more people than others because some, like business, was done in both places, but genre discourse analysis was only done outside of the United States. So as you can see here, this is just the parts of the handbook, the research perspectives, the domains, curricular design and assessment, and then teaching. Challenges, I'll just go very quickly. Resistance to co-authorship if you don't know the other person. So that was kind of interesting. Lack of familiarity with other research done in other regions. Inequality of the rank, so that you don't automatically have an entree, because some people in the US would love to do research, and some do, even though they're not on a tenure track, but it's not required and it's not rewarded often. So we've talked about the different thematic things. The challenges also is different. The databases we use to find, like MLA or LLBA or Google Scholar, whatever, are not the same. In Europe, there's something called DialNet out of La Rioja, and so many of the European things are in that and indexed only in that. And if we can't get to that, that's difficult, or we don't know about it. Different academic schedules, and of course, terminology and the pandemic. So strategies, another strategy we can use is the technological affordances. As we mentioned, Mary Reisner has this wonderful website that has been there for several years, focused on LSP. Communicate through email, websites, social media about conferences and about upcoming calls for papers, etc. I see that on Facebook all the time. And then attend in person or virtually conferences that you can afford to get to. The virtual ones so far have been the Encuentros, which I talked about, but it's only for Latin America, but the keynote speaker was from Europe. So, and then Jerez, which is the one in France, had a virtual conference co-sponsored by somebody in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and allowed for participation of several international investigators. What we really need to do in ISLSP and in other conferences here is create virtual sessions within in-person conferences so that people from Europe, people from Latin America can present and we can get to know them, and maybe they'll do the same for us. We talked about some of this, the different regions. Oh yes, getting grants, interdisciplinary grants is also wonderful. The virtual exchanges and webinars to train graduate students and tenure track faculty or contract faculty in this. The Europe also has a fantastic program that it has created a MOOC to train LSP teachers, and a summer program called Trails. So getting in touch with them to find out what they've done would be great. And of course, there's a description of it in the handbook. So people in Europe, as we said, can teach us how to do discourse analysis and work with corpora, but they can also help us understand the problems with the refugees and the immigrants that they have in their countries. And they're not Spanish-speaking immigrants, but they have to teach them Spanish for specific purposes. And so some of those insights may help us, and some of our insights working with the community may enlighten them as well. Creating a departmental culture that will value LSP as an academic field, reward and incentivize interdisciplinary research. In the book I did with Carmen and with James Wormers on CALL, training and assessing CALL online language teachers, in chapter 3, I have some strategies for getting administrators to buy in and faculty to buy into the idea of LSP. Urge mid to late career Spanish professors to make a switch, which is what I did, Lourdes, Sherry, Michael Doyle, a bunch of people, and provide training for the graduate students and people who may be going on the market, because this fall's MLA job list has no less than 8 tenure track positions that involve either SSP specifically, and or combination with translation interpretation, and only 5 lecturer and non-tenure track, which is completely against what we've seen in the past. Create and advertise more tenure track positions. I see that people are here from Colorado State, Francesca Helm, and they just hired a qualified SSP professor this fall. So I congratulate their efforts. So these strategies will help us in U.S. SSP academics to communicate, connect, and collaborate with other experts around the world in order to help us move the field forward and accomplish the major research priorities so we can take our rightful place within academia.
Thank you for Paula and Nadia for the invitation, and thank you for everyone for your attendance, and I hope to build on what Barbara has told us. So my theme is to connect LSP research to broader research communities. She's given us a lot, and I'm going to build on it. So just as a context in relation to the research group's exploration of the Language for Specific Purposes textbook, and Bobby also mentioned that we had done the survey, and there was a lot of really rich results there that are reported. And so mine is focusing on the things reported in the domain content, history, cultural perspectives, and interactions with the United States within the domains as one angle on looking at this. So not from the linguistic analysis side, but from the contents of the domains. And so there was a robust response of interest in a variety of different angles on how to do research in the content areas. So my background is in literature and culture, not linguistics. And then I got this job, which asked me to be both a Latin Americanist and to do the Spanish for Specific Purposes. That's 25 years ago. So my experience is going to be aimed at looking at those, coming at the research from that angle, and that's why I focused on the content section. Part of the goals for my presentation, I want to affirm the need for research and consider our institutional frames. I want to provide examples of how to find synergies between LSP in areas such as business history, business and other case studies, business communication, digital humanities, environmental humanities, and medical humanities. And I want to point the way for LSP practitioners to have access to new communities, these communities are keenly interested in your expertise. These communities provide a rich body of examples of interdisciplinary research, and they indicate established publication venues. So there's places that aren't LSP publication that you can publish your research within these organizations. And that is another vital way of expanding our knowledge and our influence, and also satisfying the needs of our publication expectations. So I want to briefly just look at, in a sort of superficial way, but with a point, of how is research different for the interdisciplinary LSP faculty member, or whether tenure or non-tenure, but then also what happens for the non-tenure track faculty. In comparison to, I'm at a Research One institution, how the tenure track faculty have to perceive their research in that academic expertise kind of silo model. Even the tenure track people have trouble here with interdisciplinary work. So partly interdisciplinary work does not fit easily into traditional definitions of academic expertise. So we know that. Non-tenure track research is often undercompensated and unrecognized or even erased. And I'm not going to dwell on the negatives, but it's important to be honest about them. When I was hired, I had research in my contract. I was just denied a new contract with research in it, not because they don't want me to do research, but because of equal pay for equal work and a tendency to, well, we're going to erase or hide the work you do so we don't have to pay you. That's for union conversations, right? But this is also the reason I'm bringing it up, is because we all know that the higher education is in jeopardy, and that this tendency to try to make everything cheaper and break us apart also impacts individual careers and impacts our health as we're asked to do more and more for less and less recognition. But research in this context also is incredibly free because there aren't those silo rules. And if you're not being told, well, we hired you to be a Mexicanist, so don't you do any research that is not about Mexico, it allows you to follow your creativity and the needs of your students and the needs of the world. And I'm going to focus on those adventures in the positive. So important as you start into this, and maybe you're new, a new faculty member, or you're new in the field of LSP and you don't know where to go. You're not alone. So there's others who are doing research too, and there are conversations to participate in. This is obvious, but I want to underline this third point. So of course, we all start out with our own questions, our curiosity, or we head in the directions that the institutional questions and mandates have sent us, like we need to start a language for specific purposes class. So then we start formulating questions and search terms, right? Those are the steps of research. The thing, though, that I find sometimes is that there's a tendency for people isolated in an institution who are told, oh, we don't know what this is, but this maybe will help enrollments, go create this, that they're so alone and it's so new that they think that they're inventing it from zero. And that creates a lot of lost time, a lot of loneliness, a lot of frustration. And so always just remember, do the due diligence. There is existing research, a lot of existing research to support your efforts to create your program, to decide how to do your course, and to decide in which direction you're going to go. And so then, of course, we're always finding the holes to add to the whole. You might say, but I don't have the training than this to do the research that I need to do. I don't have that training. Like, I was trained in literature. What did I know about a Spanish for business class? Well, first of all, yes, you do. Re-examine and reinvent your research skills away from the strict disciplinary content and definitions. And also, okay, you may not have all the research skills you need, but that's the whole thing of why we do what we do, is to continue learning. And that's where the freedom comes in, that we're not stuck in that silo of don't try and do anything different because it will come back to destroy you. We can articulate it in relationship to the creation of this body of knowledge that needs to be shared with students who are going to go out into the world, and all the conversations about enrollments and those sorts of things. So it's the finding and creating synergies. So I'm going to go quickly, and we can talk in the conversation more about specifics of these things. I'm not going to click on every single website that's here. But for example, I discovered at one point teaching my Spanish for translation class, but wanting the students to have more of a context for the understanding of things, a delicious book published out of Spain that was within the disciplinary field of business history. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know there was a field of business history. This is about 20 years ago. And the articles are wonderful. They're old. So part of what I'm showing is some of these things haven't been done for a while. There's a great need to continue doing it. In reading the articles, in looking at this conference, you get a sense of what kinds of tools you have and what kinds of tools you need to develop to be able to do such a project. Incredibly powerful. So I'm going to be doing an organization and a model, organization and a model. History and current practices in media. We decided to do a course in 21st century Spanish for 21st century media. There's all sorts of enriching manners based that come out of everything from cultural studies to actual, the media college, language issues, the history of the place. There's almost more than you can actually process. Every one of these books would give you a different angle to do your research from. But anything you would do would enrich this topic, and in any field that's not Spanish. But sometimes it's useful to look at the career of someone. So this man, when I found this book, the Handbook of Spanish Language Media, which is again old and could be updated, and there's another opening, or any other language could have these angles, is to look at what the person did in their career, go read their articles. Sometimes to break into a new field, it's easier this way than to start as if you had to start from zero in a PhD, because you already have your research tools, you're expanding and enhancing them. the field of business communication. So here we have the Association for Business Communication and the journal that Bobby mentioned. And here's three colleagues, the collaboration, and originally a linguist, a business communications person, a business practitioner, combining their knowledge. He created a cross-cultural communication model, and they have other expertise they applied to it, and building a book for people going to do business, which is also very useful for a class. These different angles on what does research publication look like. These are areas. Global business languages, Bobby mentioned it. I just didn't want to like flip past all this and not say. And then there really are publication venues for language for specific purposes. And remember that though they inherited this title, they have expanded to all LSP areas. Okay, communication and cross-cultural understanding. One way to work on research is when you have outstanding students who want to do a senior thesis, and then you sort of learn along with them, you guide them in their questions. I had a student who was a communications major and Spanish for the professions. She did an internship at an art institute in Spain. That led to questions about cross-cultural management in an artistic environment. So you started looking. There were two texts that were shaping texts. One is how to write case studies in any field. The other was a book that we found had shortcomings in the international aspect of managing organizational behavior. This was her field, not my field, but in reading it and using my ability to shape her to ask questions and getting the collaborative reader from the other discipline, she put together a lovely thesis. The environmental humanities are on fire. It's a crucial thing that all of us are worried about, and all of the disciplines are coming together. There are multiple kinds of organizations. And I've given you an example of someone in the language fields who's a very useful volume of chapters of all sorts of different angles on how to include sustainable development into foreign language learning, content-based instruction. Medical humanities, Bobby talked about and I have it in my next slide, the National Association of Medical Spanish, this outstanding book. Just reading this book, it's written in English, looking at the ways he dives into policy, practice, and pedagogy is a model for anybody's research project. This one is not just Spanish, it's everything. So there's this world of the medical humanities. And then these are some examples of how do you take that model and it's been applied into Spanish. These two colleagues were pure literary scholars, and they took the model of the Intro to a Literary Analysis and they retooled it to be in dialogue medical humanities. So that's an excellent model. And this is a different angle, more applied for teaching Spanish to people who are going to be medical practitioners, where this one is how to get students who need to understand culture more deeply interested by framing it through the medical themes. And then, of course, the National Association of Medical Spanish as a model to look at, and this book as a model to see how those dialogue, which I'm pretty sure there are those fields for other languages too. And then in the digital humanities, there's so much richness that I couldn't put too many pictures, and I do want to respect so that we have time for conversation, but there's the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. And this has been quick, but in closing, I just want to share a couple of thoughts from, let me stop sharing. So I've been 27 years off the tenure track. My school finally decided that you could do promotion, but then they decided to erase research out of my contract. So under the rules, it's as if my research doesn't exist, but I don't take that. And so I wrote a statement on research and as enriching teaching, which is clearly one of the tenets of our profession. So looking at how you can combine your traditional field with your new field. Early on, I was working on Mexico, urban modernization and the advent of consumer society in the post-revolutionary period. And a chronicle writer named Salvador Novo. So I published on that. I published in my dissertation, Writing the City, the Chronicles of Salvador Novo, Consumer Society and National Identity in the work of Salvador Novo and Guadalupe Loaiza. Very literary, very cultural. And then I started studying Spanish for business and the role of youth and consumerism. and I saw similar themes, and I started learning and did research and published it in JOLIB, the Journal of Language for International Business, Globalization or Colonization, Teaching Culture for Business While Promoting Social Equity. There's a pairing. I'm not going to read every single thing I did, but in relation to the digital humanities, which is one of my more recent ones, there's a lot of interest in my field in Mexico about the role of youth, and there was an election in which the use of social media by young people impacted the election. And so I did a whole study on that was published in an online activism in Latin America. But at the same time, I was trying to look into how do we teach language and use it in the media. And I did an article, Social Media, New Directions, Localization, and Language Services Between Spanish and English. So I share both these things of the content fused together in my classes, and I hope that the publications enrich other people's ability to find the meat at the center of understanding the human contexts behind the documents that we're exploring from an angle that complements and should work in hand with the approach from the linguistics view. And that's that, so we can have a conversation. Thank you.